The date is September 1st, 1939. It is 4:45 a.m. and the air is cool, while many Polish citizens are still sleeping. Suddenly, the air is filled with the screeching of German Stukas, dive-bombing planes which attack and bomb Polish cities. This is the beginning of the Second World War. Weeks beforehand, Germany made demands on the free city of Danzig in the corridor for Poland's access to the ocean. Claiming it as part of Hitler's Lebensraum, Hitler demanded the city be handed over to Germany and Poland would be left in peace. However, this was not what would happen. Communication lines were cut throughout Poland, and the Polish were left in disarray. The invasion of Poland had begun, and before long the Wehrmacht were crossing into Poland with a speed and fury the world had not yet seen before. This was Blitzkrieg, German for Lightning War. Two days later, Neville Chamberlain and the French government announced that the British and French empires, along with all of their colonies, were now at war with the German government. In a famously ill-fated and outdated strategy to combat the Germans, Polish commanders even sent horsed cavalry into battle against heavy German armor. By September 8th, German forces had reached the outskirts of Warsaw, having advanced 140 miles in the first week of the invasion. With the Soviet Union invading the eastern half of Poland, the country was doomed to the joint occupation by the Axis and Comintern. In the west, the Allied powers remained complacent behind their lines, expecting a repeat of the First World War. During this Sitzkrieg, the Allies did not move into the weakly defended Rhineland, giving up an opportunity to end the war within its opening months. On May 10th, 1940, the Germans invaded the Low Countries of Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands. These small and unprepared nations fell quickly and opened the path through the Ardennes forest into France. With the French army having moved north to fight the Germans in Belgium, the Germans managed to push through the weakly defended Argonne and began encircling French troops. With the protection of the Maginot lost, the French fought as best they could, before eventually being pushed out. By May 26th, the Allied forces of Britain and France were fighting to survive at the port city of Dunkirk. The German army had them surrounded. The German armored divisions had outrun the slower infantry divisions, and German commanders were worried about an assault on the now weakened flanks. Erwin Rommel contributed to the general angst amongst German commanders by claiming he was attacked by hundreds of British tanks at Arras, a nearby town, and was in favor of sitting tight until the infantry caught up. Well, German commanders feared another attack at Arras, and General Ewald von Kleist, commanding Panzer Group Kleist, pulled out the 10th Panzer Division from Heinz Guderian's 29th Corps advance on Boulogne and Dunkirk, and put it in reserve in case Britain and France renewed their attack at Arras. As such, these moves were moved up the chain of command to Gunther von Kluge, commander of the 4th Army, and on to Army Group A commander Gerd von Rundstedt. Von Kluge ordered a halt on May 23rd, and von Rundstedt approved of the halt when was sent it up to Oberkommando headquarters, also known as OKH, where Field Marshal Walter von Bronstas and Hitler himself okayed the halt. OKH's orders to von Rundstedt gave him the discretion of when to resume the advance. This has led to the assumption that Hitler halted the advance to give glory to the Luftwaffe, but it was instead given by von Rundstedt at the behest of Rommel and von Kleist. It was after this Hitler decided to send in the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, to pick off the British and the French, alongside with destroying any carrier vessels or aircraft that they could. This led to England calling upon the civilian flotilla to go and rescue the Allied forces across the Channel. Several hundred civilian craft sailed across the English Channel to rescue the British and French soldiers. Allied forces left behind almost all of their equipment upon the beaches, and instead chose to flee across the Channel as it was the only safe option. Many larger British ships could not cross the Channel due to the risk of German U-boats attacking them and the risk of putting the ships in danger. Paris fell to the Germans on June 14th, and the Allies had then officially lost France. With England the last bastion of democracy in Europe, it fell upon Britannia and her people to persevere. The British dealt with the Battle of Britain in which Hitler savagely bombed the British Isles. Across the Atlantic Ocean, the United States was preparing itself for the coming war. When the German delegation's tent at the 1939 World Fair went dark, most assumed it was a blackout. However, this was Germany going to war. From across the Atlantic, President Roosevelt watched the fall of Europe, barred from intervening by the United States' policy of neutrality. Ever since the First World War, the United States worked to keep itself out of European affairs. When the Great Depression hit and damaged the American economy, America became even more isolated from the rest of the world. However, Roosevelt was not planning to sit idly by while Europe fell to the Nazis, as he knew that war would come to America's shores whether the people or Congress liked it or not. As such, measurements were put in place to begin preparations for the eventual conflict. One of the first examples of this can be seen in the Selective Service Act of 1940, which was the first peacetime draft in American history. Alongside this, the buildings of planes, tanks, and battleships increased in production to prepare the military. However, by 1940, the War Readiness Survey showed that America would not be fully equipped to fight a war until 1943. At this time, Europe had fallen to the Reich, and Britain fought alone. The need for raw materials gave America its first interaction in the Second World War. At first, America traded with England through the cash and carry system, which all but ended the American arms embargo of 1936. While not directly selling weapons, it did help give Britain an edge and the ability to continue producing weapons. It was also approved by the U.S. populace and Congress, as the British had to use their own vessels for transport, along with paying up front. Over time, however, this evolved into the Lend-Lease system, which allowed weaponry and provisions to be sent as aid to the British Isles. This was risky, as many were not okay with the risks of shipping over the Atlantic, with the ever-present risk of the German Wolf Pack, the U-boat fleet that terrorized the Atlantic and Allied shipping lanes during the Battle of the Atlantic. However, this would allow the British to carry on the fight throughout the Battle of Britain, where they were starved out and bombarded constantly by the German Luftwaffe. With war looming, the supporters of FDR's New Deal had their own plans to mobilize the nation, with close oversight provided by the government. However, business leaders feared greater government control of the economy, and they resisted Roosevelt's early mobilization efforts. This was often justified under the blaming of socialism and the dissolution of capitalism as a way of going against FDR. As a result, Roosevelt was hampered by several factors: a conservative Congress that had tired of New Deal programs and wished to keep America neutral at all costs, business hostility to New Deal programs, and a lack of specific crises that could galvanize public opinion into unified action. That, along with much more, would change in the coming year of 1941, as the war took another devastating turn.
Americans must know their every phase for defense and self-protection.
In 1941, German troops crossed the border into the Soviet Union's portion of occupied Poland. Many of the Soviet troops did not understand what was happening, such as in the fortress of Brest. The fortress was seen as a major strategic advantage, making it a prime target for the Wehrmacht. Once the invasion had begun, the German army had begun the attack commenced by the Luftwaffe, which began bombarding the fortress alongside artillery, which lasted for a grand total of 29 minutes. The fortress was occupied by both servicemen and their families, meaning that civilians were also caught within the battle. While the bombardment itself lasted only 29 minutes, it led to mass disarray within the Soviet Union. As it was early in the morning, Soviet troops were caught completely off guard and scrambled to get to their positions, unaware of what was happening. Some thought it was trainings, even though it was obviously not training. While the army command scrambled to gather together what was happening, their troops ran around panicking while the artillery struck. This would soon be followed as the Wehrmacht began to cross the Bug River in order to stage an infantry assault upon the fortress. The rapid advance of the Wehrmacht did not allow the Soviets to mount a static defense against the Wehrmacht, and instead held out in pockets, particularly within the fortress itself. The Germans seized vital positions such as the field hospital, which they began to purge to make room for any injured German soldiers. Many of the civilians who were trapped inside the fortress made a desperate attempt to escape. However, the German army had ended up surrounding the fortress, cutting off all routes of escape. Many civilians and soldiers attempted an escape and only ended up finding themselves running straight into German machine gun emplacements placed in particular points where it would be easiest for civilians to exit in order to mow them down. This is a part of Hitler's final solution, which showed no remorse towards any of the Slavic citizens, in which a complete and total extermination was eventually planned. Fighting within the pockets continued on for several more days, one of which was led by Pyotr Gavrilov, who ended up leading successful Soviet sallies out of the fortress against the Germans. He would eventually go on to earn the Hero of the Soviet Union medal, even though he would be captured by the Germans at the end of the siege. His attacks helped to demoralize the Germans and buy the men inside the fortress more time. Much of the fighting during the battle would come down to brutal hand-to-hand combat, as the Soviets began to run low on ammunition and supplies, along with a mentality of death or victory. While not to the extent of the Japanese later on in the war, they would die in the name of their country. Although not all men, and some would retreat or be captured, many men would choose to charge the Germans in what would be known as a Soviet Ura charge, in which the Soviets would equip their bayonets and begin a almost suicidal charge against the Germans, planning to cause as much damage as possible. This would set the tone for much of the rest of the war in the Eastern Front, as the Soviets would fight for every scrap of land they could, trying not to give themselves up to the German invader or their rapacious violence against the Soviet people. Some Soviet troops were able to link up and coordinate their actions under the command of Captain Ivan Zubachov. His second in command was Regimental Commissar Yefim Fomin. On the 26th of June, small Soviet forces tried to break out from the siege, but sustained heavy losses and casualties, and were unsuccessful. Unfortunately, the attempt, as was said, was not successful and resulted in the deaths of many of the Soviets' remaining troops to survive. This greatly lowered the time it would take for the Germans to take and seize the fortress, and would soon lead to the defeat of the Soviets. Total German losses in the battle for Brest Fortress were about 429 killed and 668 wounded. The Soviet losses numbered about 6,800 prisoners of war and 2,000 dead. The magnitude of these losses can be weighed by the fact that the total German losses on the Eastern Front up to 30th of June 1941 amounted to 8,886 killed. The fighting at Brest therefore accounted for over 5% of all German fatalities. Stories like this can be told all throughout Operation Barbarossa, where Soviet troops fought tooth and nail to survive and for their homeland. This fight would carry on into December 1941, where another event would take place across the pond that would take focus away from Russia and instead to the tropics of Hawaii.
Полковой комиссар Фомин Ефим Моисеевич был расстрелян у Холмских ворот в конце июня 1941 года. В 1957 награжден орденом Ленина посмертно. Майор Гаврилов Петр Михайлович был взят в плен тяжело раненым на 32-й день войны. Как и многие, побывавшие в плену, был подвергнут репрессиям, исключен из партии. И только в 1957 году, Ему было присвоено звание Героя Советского Союза. В 1965 году начальнику 9-й погранзаставы лейтенанту Кижеватову Андрею Митрофановичу было присвоено звание Героя Советского Союза. Посмертно.
Japan was at war with the United States. The attack took place before any formal declaration of war was made by Japan, but this was not Admiral Yamamoto's intention. He originally stipulated that the attack should not commence until 30 minutes after Japan had informed the United States that the peace negotiations were at an end. However, the attack on Pearl Harbor began before the notice could be delivered. Tokyo transmitted the 5,000-word notification, commonly called the 14-part message, in 2 blocks to the Japanese embassy in Washington. Transcribing the message took too long for the Japanese ambassador to deliver it on schedule. In the event, it was not presented until more than an hour after the attack began. The final part is sometimes described as a declaration of war as the first wave approached Oahu. It was detected by the U.S. Army radar upon a point near the island's northern tip, but it was not yet operational. The operators reported a target, but Lieutenant Kerbert A. Tyler, a newly assigned officer, presumed it was the scheduled arrival of 6 B-17 bombers from California. The bombers had never been seen in formation this large on radar, but yet again the operators neglected to tell Tyler of its size. As the first wave of planes approached Oahu, they encountered and shot down several U.S. aircraft. At least one of these radioed a somewhat incoherent warning. Other warnings from ships off the harbor entrance were still being processed or awaiting confirmation when the attacking planes began bombing and strafing. The air portion of the attack began at 7:48 a.m. Hawaiian time, with the attack on Kaneohe. A total of 353 Japanese planes in 2 waves reached Oahu. Slow, vulnerable torpedo bombers led the first wave, exploiting the first moments of surprise to attack the most important ships present, the battleships, while dive bombers attacked U.S. air bases across Oahu, starting with Hickam Field, the largest, and Wheeler Field, the main U.S. Army Air Force fighter base. The only aerial opposition came from a handful of P-36 Hawks, P-40 Warhawks, and some SBD Dauntless dive bombers from the carrier Enterprise. In the first wave attack, about 8 of the 49 1,700-pound armor-piercing bombs dropped hit their intended targets. At least 2 of the bombs broke on impact, another detonated before penetrating an unarmored deck, and 1 was a dud. The defenders were very unprepared. Ammunition lockers were locked, aircraft parked wingtip to wingtip in the open to prevent sabotage, guns unmanned, none of the Navy's 5-inch 38s, only a quarter of its machine guns, and 4 of 31 American batteries got in action. Despite this low alert status, many American military personnel responded effectively during the attack. 90 minutes after it began, the attack was over. 2,008 sailors were killed, and 710 were wounded. 218 soldiers and airmen, who were part of the Army until they became their own branch, were killed, and 364 were wounded. 68 civilians were killed, and 35 of them were wounded. In total, 2,335 Americans died, and 1,143 were injured. Of the American fatalities, nearly half were due to the explosion of the Arizona's forward magazine after it was hit by a modified 16-inch 410mm shell. Already damaged by a torpedo and on fire, Nevada attempted to exit the harbor. She was targeted by many Japanese bombers as she got underway and sustained more hits from 250-pound bombs, which started further fires. She was deliberately beached to avoid blocking the harbor entrance. The attack on Pearl Harbor left America shocked and enraged at the Japanese Empire for attacking without a formal declaration of war. This in turn led to increase in anti-Japanese sentiment within the United States, which would soon end up leading to the internment of Japanese people within the United States, many of whom were not even close to be spies and had lived in the United States for several generations, although this was not considered by the United States, who interned them as spies all the same. This also began the United States' involvement in the war in the Pacific, and FDR's Day of Infamy speech was carried out on December 8th, calling the United States to war against Japan. This had led to all of the arming that had been occurring over 1939 through early 1941 to come to fruition, as the United States was now prepared to go to war. War production would soon increase within the United States as people had more cause to join in the fight against the Japanese. Women would begin to work in factories while men ended up going to sign up to fight in the army to fight against Japan. A day later as well, Hitler declared war on the United States in agreement with their alliance with Japan. This had brought the United States officially into World War II and would lead to America's policy of defeating Germany first, as they wished to defeat the Germans before they could overrun Europe, as then there would be no reinforcements to help them fight the Germans at a later time. With America in the war, its economy now almost entirely shifted to war, with civilians beginning to be put on rations while more food and materials went to the troops who would soon be fighting on all fronts. By late October, the German forces were worn out, with only a third of their motor vehicles still functioning, infantry divisions a third to half strength, and serious logistic issues preventing the delivery of warm clothing and other winter equipment to the front. Even Hitler had seemed to surrender the idea of a long struggle, since the prospect of sending tanks into such a large city as Moscow without heavy infantry support seemed risky after the costly capture of Warsaw in 1939. By November, the ground had frozen over, which solved the problems of mud for the armor. The Wehrmacht spearheads, consisting of 51 divisions, could now advance with the goal of encircling Moscow and linking up near Noginsk, east of the capital. The German 3rd and 4th Panzer Groups needed to concentrate their forces between the Volga Reservoir and Mosyansk, and then proceed the Soviet 3rd Army to Kiln and Snogorsk to encircle the capital from the north. Reportedly, Stalin asked Marshal Zhukov whether Moscow could be successfully defended and ordered him to speak honestly like a communist. Zhukov replied that was possible, but that reserves were urgently needed. German officers were able to make out some of the major buildings of the Soviet capital through their field glasses after capturing Kryanskaya Polyana, north of Moscow, about by 22 miles. Both Soviet and German forces were severely depleted, sometimes having only 150 riflemen, which was the company's full strength, to be left in a regiment. Because of the resistance on the northern and southern sides of Moscow, the Wehrmacht attempted a direct offensive from the west along the Minsk-Moscow highway near the city of Naro-Fominsk. This offensive had limited tank support and was directed against extensive Soviet defenses. After determined resistance from the Soviet 1st Guards Motorized Rifle Division and flank counterattack staged by the 33rd Army, the German offensive stalled and was driven back 4 days later in the ensuing Soviet counteroffensive. The European winter of 1941 and 42 was the coldest of the 20th century. On the 30th November, von Bock reported to Berlin that the temperature was 45 degrees Celsius, or negative 49 degrees Fahrenheit, which General Erhard von Rauss, commander of the 6th Panzer Division, kept track of in his war diary. These numbers indicated severely cold conditions, and German troops were freezing with no winter clothing, using equipment that was not designed for such low temperatures. More than 130,000 cases of frostbite were reported amongst German soldiers. The Axis offensive on Moscow had stopped, and Heinz Guderian wrote in his journal that the offensive on Moscow failed. We underestimated the enemy's strength, as well as his size and climate. Fortunately, I stopped my troops on the 3rd of December, otherwise the catastrophe would have been unavoidable. On the 5th of December 1941, the counteroffensive for removing the immediate threat to Moscow started on the Kalinin front. The southwestern front and western fronts began their offensives the next day. On the 8th of December, Hitler had signed his directive, number 39, ordering the Wehrmacht to assume a defensive stand along the eastern front. German troops were unable to organize a solid defense at their present locations and were forced to pull back to consolidate their lines. Guderian wrote that discussions with Hans Schmidt and Wolfram Führer von Richthofen took place the same day. Both commanders agreed that the current front line could not be held. On December 14th, Franz Halder and Gunther von Kluge finally gave permission for a limited withdrawal to the west of the Oka River, without Hitler's approval. On the 20th of December, during a meeting with German senior officers, Hitler cancelled the withdrawal and ordered his soldiers to defend every patch of ground, digging trenches with howitzer cells if needed. Guderian protested, pointed out that losses from the cold were actually greater than by combat, and winter equipment was held by traffic ties in Poland. Nevertheless, Hitler insisted on defending the existing lines, and Guderian was dismissed on December 25th, along with Generals Hoppener and Straussle. Walther von Braunst, Hitler's commander-in-chief, had been removed even earlier on the 19th of December. The Red Army's winter counteroffensive drove the Wehrmacht from Moscow, but the city was still considered to be threatened, with the front line still relatively close. Because of this, the Moscow theater remained a priority for Stalin, but first appeared to be in shock due to initial German success. However, immediately after the Moscow counteroffensive, a series of Soviet attacks, known as the Battles of Vyaziev, were attempted against the salient, each time with heavy losses on both sides, but eventually resulting in a Soviet victory. These victories allowed the Soviets to push back against the Germans in the north, leading to further victories for the Russians and more losses for the Germans, which continued to mount, beginning to get closer and closer towards the millions. While the Soviets had lost countless men, their production front continued to increase exponentially, with much of the Russian industry being turned exactly towards war. The production of new tanks such as the T-34 would soon shape the war and begin to change its course, while the Germans also continued their innovations. It was at this time that Stalin began pressuring the Allies for aid in the West, and to open up a second theater to draw the Germans away. However, Winston Churchill, concerned with growing Soviet power and wished to maintain what control the British had left over Europe, did not approve of this plan, also wishing to increase British air power over the British Isles in order to stop German aerial raids. Meanwhile, in America, the shift was focused more on defeating the Italians and Germans in North Africa. Aside from the American Lend-Lease, the Russians had no help to be gotten from the Western Allies, save the American material that was being pumped in across the Bering Strait. It seemed Russia was still to face the fascist Hydra alone. But for how long is the question? In the Pacific, 6 months after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Japanese attempted another attack on Hawaii. With the help of Native American codebreakers, the United States was able to ready itself for the battle, where they intercepted the Japanese fleet at Midway Island. An important turning point in the Pacific campaign, this battle would allow the United States and its allies to move into an offensive position. The fleet engagement between the U.S. and Japanese navies in the Pacific Ocean resulted from Japan's desire to sink the American aircraft carriers that had escaped destruction at Pearl Harbor. Admiral Yamamoto chose to invade a target relatively close to Pearl Harbor in order to draw out the American fleet. Instead, the Americans managed to break the Japanese naval codes, allowing Admiral Chester W. Nimitz to understand the exact Japanese plans. Nimitz placed available U.S. carriers in position to surprise the Japanese moving up for their preparatory airstrikes on Midway Island itself. American radio nests in the Pacific picked up various orders Yamamoto had dispatched to prepare his forces for the operation. As early as May 2nd, messages that were intercepted began to indicate some forthcoming operation, and on May 16th, the position, tactics, and location of the fleet were revealed by the codebreakers. By the time the Americans were ready, the Japanese plans were almost entirely revealed, allowing an extremely detailed plan to be hatched. American combat forces took over where intelligence efforts left off. Scouts found the Japanese early in the morning of June 4th. Although initial strikes by Midway-based planes were not successful, American carrier-based planes turned the tide. Torpedo bombers became separated from the American dive bombers and were slaughtered, but they diverted the Japanese defenses just in time for the dive bombers to arrive. The Japanese carriers were caught while refueling and rearming their planes, making them especially vulnerable. The Americans managed to sink all 4 Japanese fleet carriers, the entire strength of the task force, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, with 322 aircraft and over 5,000 sailors. The Japanese also lost the heavy cruiser Mikuma. American losses included 147 aircraft and more than 300 seamen. Midway helped to shatter Japanese air power as Japan lost all of its aircraft carriers and all of their planes, which left the Pacific highly vulnerable to American and Allied forces. This victory allowed America to swing its focus towards its first island, Guadalcanal, where it would begin its first island assault of the war. By 1942, Australia was under threat from the Japanese, who had overrun the Dutch East Indies. As such, they called upon America for aid, pointing at the airstrip at Guadalcanal in particular. American forces in Australia were soon prepared to attack Guadalcanal, which would be their first taste of combat during the war. Many soldiers were fresh sign-ups just out of boot camp, who left their families and lives behind in America, which itself would open up opportunities for women to take the leading role in factories. The Battle of Guadalcanal was the first major offensive and land victory for the Allies in the Pacific theater. However, when the Allies did arrive on Guadalcanal, they encountered minimal to no resistance. When the second wave of troops landed on the beaches of Guadalcanal, they found the first wave of Marines sitting on the beach, eating fruits and coconuts and other tropical foods and stuff. This led many of the new, unexperienced American soldiers to believe that this would not be a hard fight. It would instead be an easy war, with no real fighting or combat to have to worry about. During a surprise attack by the Japanese at the Battle of Savo Island, 1 Australian and 3 American cruisers were sunk, and 1 American cruiser and 2 destroyers were damaged. Admiral Turner decided to withdraw his remaining naval forces by the evening of August 9th, and in doing so left the Marines ashore with much of the heavy equipment, provisions, and troops still aboard the transports. Admiral Makawa's decision not to attack and destroy the Allied transport ships when he had the opportunity proved to be a crucial strategic mistake. It was at this point the Japanese began ferrying and stationing troops on the island in secret in order to catch the Americans off guard, as there was no more navy to protect them from the Japanese. After midnight on August 21st, Japanese commander Ichiki's main body of troops arrived at the east bank of Tenaru Creek on Guadalcanal, and were surprised to encounter Marine positions, not having expected to find United States forces located so far from the airfield. Nearby U.S. Marine listening posts had heard sounds before withdrawing to the west bank of the creek. At 1:30, Ichiki's force began the first attack on Marine positions on the west bank of the Tenaru. Marine machine gun fire and canister rounds from mortars killed many of the Japanese soldiers as they attempted to cross the creek. A few Japanese soldiers managed to reach Marine positions, engaged in hand-to-hand combat with the defenders, and captured a few Marine frontline emplacements. A company of Marines held in reserve just behind the front line attacked and killed most, if not all, of the remaining Japanese soldiers that had breached the front lines, ending Ichiki's first assault about an hour after it had began. At 2:30, a second wave of Japanese troops again attacked across the sandbar and was again almost completely wiped out by the American Marines. The Japanese forces were wiped out over time by American artillery and strafing runs from the airfield on the island. By the end of the battle on February 9th, 1943, the Japanese had lost 2/3 of the 31,400-man army that they had committed to the island, whereas the United States Marines and the United States Army had lost than 2,000 soldiers of about 60,000 deployed. By far the most significant loss for Japan was both the airfield on the island and the decimation of elite naval aviators. After Guadalcanal, many military historians say Japan had no realistic hope of withstanding the counteroffensive of an increasingly powerful United States and was on the defensive from that point on. American Marine John Basilone was awarded the Medal of Honor for his part in the battle, helping to stem a Japanese attack on the airfield and severely wounding himself in the process. He would be sent home by the United States for propaganda purposes in order to help raise support for the buying of war bonds and to increase overall war support. The no-surrender spirit of the Japanese on the island led to an increasingly hardened view of the Americans upon the Japanese. Many Japanese soldiers would fake surrenders before blowing themselves up in bonsai charges, which would lead Americans to refuse to take prisoners of the Japanese, preferring to shoot them instead, which may seem barbaric, but seemed the only real option to save lives in that time. This also marked the beginning of true island warfare, as the Japanese would continue waging guerrilla warfare on the island for several more months after the Americans had cleared out. This was true on many other islands as well, but for the time being, the Americans had secured Guadalcanal and the safety of Australia.
Look at them all. I mean, we chewed them up.
They just kept on coming.
A real turkey shoot.
The Second World War had brought America out of the Great Depression. America was in a full wartime boom. Former peacetime companies switched to full wartime production, such as Browning making the Browning machine gun instead of nice, handy pocket knives. Hershey was making, well, Hershey, but for soldiers. Jeeps were being produced, planes, tanks, anything you can think of, it was there. Pershing cars, they're tanks now, which is a lot cooler than cars, but that's besides the point. In the United States as well, a rationing system was there to guarantee the minimum amounts of necessities. Tires were the first time to be rationed in 1942, alongside gasoline and rubber. In 1942, the Combined Food Board was set up to coordinate the worldwide supply of food to the Allies, with special attention to flows from the US and Canada to England and France. Although, France was in Africa, but we haven't gotten there yet. We'll get there, don't worry. The public paid 3/4 of the face value of a war bond and received the full value back after a set number of years. This led to an increased boom in Americans really wanting to buy war bonds, because not only were war bonds pretty nifty for your own economic benefit after the war, but they had some really neat propaganda, which we'll get to shortly. Women also joined the workforce to replace men who had joined the forces, though in fewer numbers. Roosevelt had stated that the efforts of civilians at home to support the war through personal sacrifice was as critical to winning the war as the efforts of the soldiers themselves. Rosie the Riveter became the symbol of women laboring and manufacturing. The war effort brought about significant changes in the role of women in society as a whole. Women began also functioning in other male-centric jobs, such as construction and engineering, which led to increased post-war support for female education and voting rights. Race issues were also put on hold for the time being, as many civil rights groups understood that if the United States fell to the war, then there would be no hope whatsoever, and they would all fall victim to Hitler's final solution, which basically meant they were all going to die if the Americans didn't win. And as such, they were willing to cooperate with the United States government, which in turn was much more lenient towards their own policies, working towards banning racial discrimination in factories during the war in order to keep production high and unions and civil rights groups happy, and etc. Labor unions also had their chance to grow stronger during the war, as the government put pressure on employers to recognize unions to avoid the sort of turbulent struggles of unions in the 1930s, which usually ended pretty bad for one group or the other, though usually the unions. And Roosevelt was like, well, you know what? We really don't need infighting right now, when we're a bit busy fighting Nazis and, of course, the Japanese, because that would be pretty bad if we were fighting ourselves instead of fighting them. Unions were also able to maintain and secure benefits from manufacturers who wanted to keep the unions happy at the time anyways, but then that would mean they'd also lose money, and no one wants to lose money, especially major businesses, because that's pretty bad, and then they don't want to collapse, especially with this major wartime boom that has lifted them out of the nightmare that was the Great Depression into the World War boom of economy that America has, because, you know, we're huge, and we have factories, and we're really good at producing way too many things. The wage difference between higher skilled and less skilled workers narrowed, and enormous increases for blue-collar wage workers and incomes in working class households shot up, while the salaried middle class lost ground, which wasn't all that good. But overall, America's economy was skyrocketing, and this was also in part to the wonderful thing known as war bonds. Remember those that I brought up about a few minutes ago? Yeah, well, they were great, and we'll get into that in a second, because war bonds, well, they helped you. You'd pay for them, and then after the war, you would get paid back. That money you put towards war bonds, plus interest. Isn't that wonderful? Yeah, I know. And that carries into the next thing. Because how on earth do you get all these people to go, I really want to spend my money on this thing that I don't get money for later, even though we've been saving up money so we don't go poor and lose our house during the Depression? Well, it's simple. The wonderful thing known as propaganda. Oh yeah, propaganda's great.
And when we've lit that torch of liberty in each
Event occurred which was destined
Propaganda, one of the best things to come out of World War II, because it just looks nice nowadays. But back then, it was used to make sure that the public actually supported the war, bought war bonds, did what they were supposed to, and didn't make things hard for America, which would be pretty bad, as I mentioned earlier. Advertising campaigns were heavily focused around patriotism, and large-scale campaigns were launched to sell war bonds, promote efficiency in factories, and keep rumors down. The war consolidated the advertising industry role in American society, deflecting earlier criticism. This was especially helpful as America was still pretty divided, as mentioned earlier, and the last thing America needed was to be killing each other over this. And as such, lots of things were heavily censored, such as music, people. Like, you don't want to talk, because if you talk, loose lips sink ships, quite literally. You don't know who's a spy. People were afraid of Nazi spies. There were no Nazi spies. Well, there were Nazi spies, but they weren't as common as people thought. But anyways, the media cooperated, and they made lots of propaganda films, and that warned people of things such as slacking off or not paying war bonds. Private snafu film cartoons belied that rumor. Alongside this, many Americans also loved these things because they were hilarious. Many famous American authors, such as Dr. Seuss, also made wartime propaganda as well. Looney Tunes, such as the one you're seeing now, also went up against the Nazis to mock them, because the Nazis can be mocked pretty easily, especially with the way Hitler talks. I mean, have you heard him? He's pretty funny, I'd say. But anyways, propaganda helped to maintain the American public and keep the public image up along with public morale. Musicians such as Bing Crosby and the Andrews Sisters produced patriotic songs as well to rally the people, such as the Victory Polka and Hot Time in the Town of Berlin. 2 hits during the time, and which are now underrated classics. But, alongside this, the War Department demanded that all enemy nationals be removed from war zones along the West Coast in response to Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor and the war in the Pacific. The American government worked towards moving the 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry from California, Oregon, and etc. into the center of the United States. Roosevelt looked at the secret evidence available to him, in which how the Filipinos in the Philippines had worked to cooperate with the Japanese. Some of them, not all of them, but Most of the adult Japanese in California had been strong supporters of Japan in the war against China, and there was evidence that espionage complied by code breakers that decrypted messages from Japan and agents in North America and Hawaii before and after the attack on Pearl Harbor. These magic capabilities were kept secret from all but those with the highest clearance, such as Roosevelt. Magic's a great thing. I mean, it helped us with Pearl Harbor. But it didn't, but it did, because we kind of knew it was happening, but we didn't. We all thought it was going to be in the Philippines. On February 19, 1942, Executive Order 9066 was set up, which designated military areas in the Midwest for people of questionable loyalties, also known as the Japanese, to be sent to. American-born children and youth who had dual U.S. and Japanese citizenship were also imprisoned, while Japanese and Italians were not. This was backed by the Korematsu vs. United States case in the Supreme Court, which was backed by everyone except one independent, and two who were supported or put in place by Herbert Hoover. But Herbert Hoover wasn't in power anymore, and they went against what Roosevelt was for, so of course it didn't work. So, in the end, the Japanese were interned, and nothing could really be done to stop it. They would later be compensated after the war, but not for a long time after several civil court cases happened. And America still really doesn't like to talk about it, because why would we? We were pretty bad to the Japanese during World War II. Well, citizens anyways. But there's nothing that can be helped about it. America was pretty bad when it came to racism, but as it was. As such, the American home front was stable and continued its increased production, making America the giant, beastly behemoth that it was, with all its industrial might and power. By spring 1942, despite the failure of Operation Barbarossa to defeat the Soviet Union, the Wehrmacht had captured vast expanse of territory, including Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltic republics. Elsewhere, the war had been progressing well, such as the U-boat offenses in the Atlantic, and Erwin Rommel had just captured Tobruk in the east. Leningrad was stabilized, but still under siege. The initial objectives for the Germans in the region around Stalingrad were the destruction of industrial capacity and to take the Volga River. This would be key to capturing the Caucasus and the oil fields head in Baikal. On July 1942, Hitler personally rewrote the operational objectives for the 1942 campaign, including the city of Stalingrad. Both sides attached great value upon the city that bore Stalin's name, as Stalin would not be too happy if Hitler decided to take his city with his name on it, because that wouldn't be too good. As such, Stalin refused to allow civilians to evacuate, demanding that all who can shoot, and all that can work. The city was heavily defended, but was bombarded heavily by German Stukas and artillery. When the Germans occupied the city, around 40,000 were moved to Germany as slave workers, while some managed to escape the city during the battle, and only a few were evacuated. In February 1943, only between 10,000 to 60,000 civilians were still alive in Stalingrad. Much of the city was quickly turned to rubble, although some factories continued production while working, such as the Stalingrad tractor factory, which continued to turn out T-34 tanks until German troops entered the factory. Stalin brought all available troops to the east bank of the Volga, and some came from as far away as Siberia. Regular troop transports were destroyed by the German Luftwaffe and were replaced with civilian ferries and other small craft in order to transport troops across the river. Civilians, including workmen and children, were put to work building trenches and fortifications. However, the Soviets were eventually pushed back to the very edges of the Volga River, leaving the only way of supply to the city from across the bank of the Volga. The destruction of the city was so immense that the Soviet oil reserves in the southern and northern parts of the city along the bank of the Volga and were lit on fire, leading to the entire river being lit ablaze with oil and death. However, Stalin would not allow traitors or cowards to be tolerated, and he dispatched commissar squads under the order number 227, stating not one step back. So officers were dispatched and forced to execute any soldier that attempted to flee from the battle. This decreased morale, however, increased courage amongst the Soviet troops, as they would rather charge forwards and die at the enemy guns than at the hands of their own countrymen. This once again can be compared to the fighting style of the Japanese in the Pacific Theater. However, this was motivated less by devotion to the emperor, which, well, the Soviets didn't have an emperor, but more to the cause of the Soviet Union and to the wish for self-preservation. There was also the wish to protect their families and friends from the Germans as well, which also led to the increased defense of the Soviets, as they knew that death or failure would result in the deaths of millions more of their countrymen. was in Stalingrad as well that some of the most brutal German killings of civilians occurred, as many civilians would be captured and tortured and then executed in front of Soviet defended places by the Germans in order to intimidate and demoralize them. This, however, only furthered to strengthen the resolve of the Soviets, who fought with a much further ferocity. In the city itself, the combat was extremely violent and brutal and can be compared to that was seen on the Pacific Front. Civilians were often caught in the crossfire, as fighting in the city often fought from house to house, street corner to street corner. It was often almost resolved in close quarters, with shovels, knives, bayonets, even bludgeoning people to death with the butts of the guns. The battle turned in the Soviets' favor under the counteroffensive codenamed Operation Uranus, which was stretched from November 19th through the 23rd, which had been planned by Zhukov. It was launched 2 spearheads some 50 miles north and south of the Germans, whose tip was at Stalingrad. The counter-offensive utterly surprised the Germans, who thought the Soviets of incapable of mounting such an attack. The operation was a deep penetration maneuver, attacking not the main German force at the forefront of the battle, but instead hitting the weaker flanks. Those flanks were vulnerably exposed on the open steppes surrounding the city and were weakly defended and undermanned. The attacks quickly penetrated deep into the flanks, and by November 23rd, the 2 prongs of the attack had linked up at Kalach, about 60 miles west of Stalingrad. The encirclement of the 2 German armies in Stalingrad was complete, and the German High Command urged Hitler to allow Paulus and his forces to break out of the encirclement and rejoin the main German forces outside the city and the encirclement. Hitler would not accept this and ordered von Paulus to stand and fight. With winter setting in and food and medical supplies dwindling, Paulus's forces grew weaker. In mid-December, Hitler ordered one of the most talented German field marshals, Erich von Manstein, to perform a special army corps to rescue Paulus's forces. This failed, along with Operation Saturn, which was the German name, and Soviet operations closed in as part of Operation Ring in January 1943. The situation was hopeless. The Germans were completely surrounded and annihilated, leaving the Soviets victorious on the Eastern Front. After this, the Soviets would continue their push westward against the Germans, striking victory after victory. At the Battle of Kursk, the Soviets would secure the largest tank victory in a tank battle the world has ever seen to this day. More Soviet and German tanks clashed on the field than would be seen up until and through the modern day. At Leningrad, the city was under siege since Operation Barbarossa began in 1941 and was liberated in 1943. More people died in both Stalingrad and Leningrad than Americans and British died on every front totaled. The Eastern Front was truly the most devastating front in the European conflict, although the Americans and British had finally arrived and began to fight the Germans in the West. After a victory by George Patton at El Alamein, the Americans quickly moved in and began to attack the Axis powers, starting by landing in Sicily.